Well, I've missed the last two lab symposiums, so I'm great to be here over in Perth again. I used to work up in the Pilbara area many years ago. So the main topic that I want to talk about today is accreditation in laboratories, and we've seen snippets of that conversation already, and I'm so thankful for both for Graham and Ian, because they've talked about the implications of accreditation in laboratories already, so I can leverage on that. So yeah, been around a long time with the CCLAS product. I still dream about it at night time, so it's one of my passions. And I'm now working with the software development team, putting CCLAS into the future versions and improvements along the way. But I still have a very close relationship with customers. And some of your labs have been visiting too already, but maybe not your generation. I might have been there when we first installed CCLAS 20 years ago. So it's great to see some names and around the place. It's just not working. Click on that. Try and click on that. There we go. So look, really, not enough about me. You don't need to know about me. Lots of experience, mainly around computerisation in laboratories. ISO 17025. Now, people may have heard of it. Hands up whose labs have heard about 17025. Yep. Keep your hand up if you're already certified for 17025. Labs, yes. Okay, so that's an interesting poll, because a lot of people have heard about it, but not too many people are yet certified for it. And it is a journey under which laboratories need to take. And it's not an easy journey. I have to be very careful as I say, look, it's not an easy journey for lab. You've heard even this morning Ian talk about all those records you've got to keep. Graham's talking about fit for purpose testing for chemistry. And remember systems about how they planned a process to be improved. So ISO 25, it talks more about the types of things you need to control and record in your laboratory, but not necessarily how. The standard is written such that it says, well, you must be able to do these things, but doesn't tell you how to do those things. And it's very much a journey of discovery for a laboratory who wants to think about getting ISO accreditation. It applies to all sorts of different laboratories, and there's no one fixed model that allows you to just say, well, here's everything I need to do for my lab and drop it in. So I have to sort of warn anybody who's looking at ISO 17025, it is a journey, and it will challenge your resources to get to that point. Basically, you need to have a traceability back to some corporate, internationalized, traceable standard. And it's about procedures. We talked about procedures this morning with Ian. Having procedures for things that you can come back later on, hand on heart, and say, we followed that procedure, and this is the way we know we followed that procedure. Some instances, it is a mandatory requirement. There may be places where you've got to have accreditation, otherwise you can't report your results. And we talked about it already this morning. We're just drowning in tasks. If we're a chemist in the lab, we want to get samples in, results out. Bookkeeping is not part of our forte. Balancing all this record keeping you need to do to maintain your accreditation is not something you want to take on lightly, but sometimes you've got no choice. You may have to do it. And as a good laboratory management team, you should have records for things. And we talked about earlier this morning about training, and the big thing for me is safety. I've been in a laboratory where we've had people injured because they'd made shortcuts in the chemistry testing or the physical handling of samples. We've had people lose fingers just because they didn't follow procedures. So procedures are great to get the right result. Procedures and processes are also there to make sure people go home at the end of the day with all their fingers and toes and eyes and ears that they had at the start of the shift. So yeah, it's a big thing, and we often as lab managers just drown in all these things we have to do. There's that axiom, if you don't record it, it hasn't happened. If you can't prove you've done something, you may as well say, well, you've got no proof at all. It hasn't happened. And the other one is that you only give attention to those things you're going to be measured on. So if you're not going to be measured on it, you don't give it any credence. And we talked about already the balance between getting the results out on time and all this compliance requirements we have to keep. And it is a problem that every laboratory will have. how they make sure their results get out on time, but also keep all the bookkeeping and compliance so that those results that are consumed by your end users can be taken with confidence that there's no errors. So yeah, that's a constant problem for labs. So how can Datamine help? Not all aspects of accreditation can be managed by the LIMS. There's so many things that are outside of the LIMS sphere that are still part of compliance. So don't think a LIMS is the only system you'll need to get your compliance. Laboratories have to get certified for this, not the LIMS products. Obviously, as a LIMS vendor, we want to say, look, yeah, CCLAS can help you get your accreditation, maintain it, but CCLAS and any LIMS product is not ISO accredited in that way. The laboratory and your processes are what gets accredited. So Datamine can assist. We talked about Ian and his laboratory advisory services, and of course, CCLAS can help in a way as well. So we've talked about staff. So in the areas of CCLAS, and I love having this session just before lunch because you're really enthused to get this session done. So I've got you till about, I'm not sure, lunchtime. As a system, CCLAS needs to know who you are when you do your work. So the first thing is you've got to have unique user records. And the last thing you should do is share user records. Don't have a generic logon at the instrument. Have an individual logon. Don't share your password. Don't put your post-it notes up passwords. Now, for IT people, that's a big no-no, but it's a very common thing in the lab to people have the same user for most of the workstations. So the big thing for accreditations, you cannot have that. You must have unique identifications, and you've got to have a password that keeps track of it. We've talked about training records. Now, those training records may dovetail into LIMS. Now, training records is to keep track of what you've been trained in and how to do it. Sometimes the LIMS can dovetail into that and ensure that you do have the right record. Otherwise, the LIMS doesn't let you do something. But there's so many things that happen in the laboratory that are not computerized that the LIMS can't control that. So where there's a LIMS computerized interaction, then the CCLAS or the LIMS can talk to your accreditation records and make sure that person is up to scratch with their training and hasn't expired, had they been trained on that particular technique, that particular instrument. As well as that is obviously the authority levels. Can they do that particular function within your LIMS product? Are they authorized to create that record or delete that record? So there's aspects of LIMS around both keeping track of who they are they permitted to do it, and are they trained to do it? The standard talks about you need to have records of who your clients are. Now, it's a given that you've got a record of them, but often I've seen in LIMS, they've just got a very simple code for the client. The accreditation requirements does say you need to know exactly who your clients are. So don't just put a client code in the system, put their names and addresses and information, the people's names. We've got the ability to track projects as well. So having that information against your testing regimes means that you can query the system, you can put them on the right Power BIs. So don't skimp on recording those sort of names and addresses and postcodes and numbers, etc., even though you may not need them to get the samples in and out, but it's part of that compliance that you should keep proper records. Having your vendors and the people who supply services to you are also part of that Australian standard. So you may want to put the vendors you use for consumables, calibration services, training services, have them in the system as well, so they're available. There's a concept, if it's not in a database, then it's out of control. It's in Word documents, spreadsheets, whatever. If it's in the database, then you can query it, you can present it in different ways. There's something in the standard about managing client complaints. Now, we don't like hearing client complaints, but they do come. And the Australian standard, the ISO standard, does have some clear guidelines as to how do you, as an organisation, how do you, as a laboratory, manage those client complaints when they come through. And you need a system to handle that. Now, for those people who are used to CCLAS, the concept of a job, which represents typically a group of samples for a group of tests, that word job can be reused to say, well, here's a task I have to do in the laboratory, It may have some records down, it may have some columns across. CCLAS doesn't care whether that's a client complaint job you're tracking or analysis request job. So when you're thinking about, I'll use that term regularly, for those people who are used to CCLAS jobs, you could create a job to do almost anything, to track almost anything. I've been to clients where they've had jobs to represent the football pools and who's people on coffee rosters. It was a simple way to have a system of records down and columns across. What we use it for is up to us. So the idea of having a job to represent a client complaint that may be tracked through the system, it's given us an owner, it may have a due date, it's got some outcomes, it may be a report, who knows. So as you're thinking about clients, you may want to say, well, I can use a job for a job to track a client complaint. Instrument management. We've talked about instrument interfacing and integration, but the idea that every piece of equipment in your laboratory, whether it's a pipette through to a $500,000 ICP, should be tracked in some sort of register. And CCLAS generally has the ability to track that, but I've seen many labs who just only put those instruments that they're going to interface into CCLAS. So my encouragement to you is to go through every piece of equipment in your laboratory. If you don't already have an equipment register, use the capability of CCLAS to keep that track of asset number, who's the supplier, when was it commissioned, serial numbers, model numbers, put all that information in, because once it's in the database, you can pull it out and put on reports. The most common thing I've seen is that you'll have some instrument software running on the instrument, and that will have its own internal system. You'll have the results coming out of the instrument into CCLAS, but all the calibration, all the operational information is stored back in the instrument software. And this is where it's less controlled. It'll be common usernames. It may not be backed up. It's not in a place where you query it easily externally. So I'm a great believer in, if there's data you can get out of your instruments, not so much to calibrate the instruments, but to capture that calibration data, pull it out of the system, put it into a job, put it into a CHD if necessary, put it into the ability to chart it within CCLAS. It's allowing you as lab managers to have your fingerprints all over that data, even though it's not to calibrate the instrument, but to capture that. So have a think about the data that you have available, not just the result data that you're testing, but other metadata that can come out of that and be stored, again, into special jobs if necessary. The standard talks about monitoring the equipment. Now, typically, we'll have an instrument doing its analysis, and when it's finished, it'll spit a result out. But there's so much potential for telemetry to be placed on that instrument software. So there might be parameters and measurements and voltages and vacuum pressures that could potentially come out of those into some telemetry system. So definitely the idea of uploading to the instrument the sample numbers you're using, sample names, that eliminates one aspect of errors, getting the data back off the system, but also the calibration results of the system back into a system where in CCLAS you can check all that information again. Graham talked about method development, method right fit for purpose. There's so many properties that we could manage, and we do manage within CCLAS for that chemistry method, the SOP that we have to follow, all those traceability back to corporate standards, international standards, version control within within the schemes, having the ability to, over time, change the test method, but have it traceable to what that version was at that particular time. Linking to documentation is always a big thing. We talked about documentation. Whenever you've got a new test method or even an existing one, the standard says you must need to be able to verify that test method at the beginning of its life was traceable back to something else. And so the ability to verify a test method with all the exportation of results, checks and balances, and that needs to be done regularly to make sure that the test method is still giving the same results that it did when it was first commissioned. Formulas, factors. I've seen places where this fancy formula goes into CCLAS, and I ask the question, where'd you get that formula from? No, I know. It's in the system, it gets used, but it's not traceable back to something that may be an official standard. Factors in formulas are classic. Where did you get that factor from? Oh, it's the factor we've always done. That's the international factor. Well, is it? So having the ability to record factors and formulas in CCLAS that are traceable back to some other source is very important. And obviously, verifying the test method gets the right result. Does it get the same result for different operators? If you have two choice of instruments, do both instruments get the same result for the same test? Quality control. This is my big passion. When you've got a quality control system that's embedded in CCLAS, you've got the ability to not only inject those QC standards and reference materials and replicates and duplicates and spikes, but you've got the ability to set those limits up. Now, having the right limits set on those standards and blanks at the beginning will pay dividends for a long time. If you leave them too loose at the beginning, then everything will pass. And it's only when it hits the fan that you realise, well, those limits should have been tighter. So at the very beginning, set up those limits as to what you should be getting against the certified values of those standards. And as we talked about, total versus soluble, the standard reference has to be fit for purpose for your test. So if you have a total copper, make sure you put the results in there for total copper. If it's an acid-soluble copper, these things have to be certified. So when you put those results into CCLAS, so certified results, and then CCLAS can monitor those over time, you've got to get those results in right first. And that will pay dividends every time that test method is performed and those QC samples are analysed. There is a need to routinely re-verify that your reference materials are still getting the same results they did a long time ago. Materials go off. There's inter-batch variations. So having the ability to run a standard regularly in a way that you can compare it against other standards on a regular basis is very important. Having a QC standard or blank in every rack that you run through is great, but is the material itself deteriorating that you need to test against? So that the ability to track your consumables of your reference materials and regularly check them against others is very important. I'm sure you've seen, you get batches of standards, particularly commercial standards, and they've got a lot number, a batch number, and you hope like crazy that that batch number gives the same certified result as the previous batch, and sometimes they don't. And so having batch variations between reference stamps is something that labs have to be very conscious of, even as to which jar you've taken it out of. We've all opened up a jar, taken a portion out, put the jar lid back on, and come back and say, "Oh, that's a different colour. How come there's a spot of red in there and it should be white, or vice versa?" And someone has inadvertently had dirty spatulas, and you've contaminated that jar of standards, and you have to put it to one side. Okay, well, that's just wasted. If you don't know it, you don't know which jar you've even taken from. It's something you can't trace it back to. Stock controls, inventory. We talked about labels not running out. Make sure you've got labels and printers. Reference standards are the same. You've got to have enough inventory that you don't get caught short. And you say, "Oh, I can't do that method because I haven't got the right standard." Or you replace it with an alternative and it doesn't do those range checks that Graham was talking about before. And obviously be able to plot up and statistics on the QC samples is very important. So look, QC in CCLAS is a very strong part of CCLAS. And it's come out because CCLAS was originally designed for labs. Back in the dark ages. Obviously, tracking samples. This is one of the fundamental pillars of a LIMS is to track those samples through from registration, sometimes even sampling, registration, receipt, through analysis, sample storage long-term, traceability, where they are, who's handled them, different portions within the same sample. If you split the sample into two, tracking the workflow statuses, is the status on the sample, on the test, on the result, on the job, are they all in sync? Can you trust them? Having the ability to have multiple levels of validation of the results. We talked about having some arm's length, some ability to say, well, one person can do the test, somebody else should verify it. Now, that applies to methods, but also the ISO standard talks about multiple levels of validation. You don't want it necessarily the person who does the test is the person who reviews and reports the test. There should be some other person or system that can check those results. And this is where CCLAS can come in with the sort of semi-automation of the assessment and the validation of those results. But sooner or later, someone will say, look, those results are good to go. And it should really be a different person who did the test work. Tracking more than just the test results. there's so many things that those samples touch along the way that typically we just capture the zinc, the copper, the bismuth. What about which oven it went into? What about which balance it was used on? What digester? What sample prep equipment? What riffle? What crusher? All those pieces of things that touch those samples could be part of the traceability of the final results. It's not just the iron and copper at the end. It's everything that's touched along the way. And if you've got the traceability right from the very beginning as to which piece of equipment, who did it, when, then you can come back later on and say, well, I found a crushing machine that's not doing the right thing, or a milling machine that's got some fault and is putting more iron into the mill than it should. If you don't know which mill it went through, you've got no way of knowing which samples you need to retest. So think about the non-analytical tasks, those sample handling, sample preparation tasks that would along the way trace through, so that when you finally get a result and it has to be questioned, you can go right back through every person, every piece of equipment that sample has touched right through the beginning. Obviously, having the system out to archive the jobs and have them retrievable, that the standard talks about, data must be available. There may be legal reasons you need to have data available for 10, 15 years. So not only do you need a system now, you need to think about long term. Okay, can I get the data back in 5, 10 years' time? And obviously the ability to track the samples through the locations. Now, in some laboratories, it is absolutely important to know where that piece of sample material is in the lab and how did it get there. You know, we've been labs in precious metals in Africa, and they want to have a balance at every door. So you scan it off, you weigh it, you go, the next guy takes custody, he weighs it. You know, if it's a precious metal platinum bit of sample, you don't want to have a bit of weight loss. That's not typically our case here, but knowing where the samples are location-wise and long-term storage is very important. If a customer said, look, can you pull those samples out and retest them, and you don't know where they are in the warehouse, you could spend months trying to find those in a warehouse system. So tracking the samples longer term is all part of this job and sample tracking systems. Reporting, like in the old days, it was a printed copy, you printed it off, you signed it and put an envelope and you sent it away. These days, we've been talking about this electronic transfer, the CHD portals, etc. There's still sometimes a requirement to get a printed copy that gets signed and put in the post. Typically, it's a PDF that may be electronically signed. But having the traceability as to the report templates, who's approved that report template, are there calculations in the report engine itself? You know, when you've got a crystal reporting, which you may not use, but some labs do, a crystal reporting is a programmatic report engine, so you can do calculations and manipulations inside the report engine. So it's not data the LIMS is generated, but it's data inside the template. Now, if that doesn't have version control, you see the data in the CCLAS, you see the data in the report and say, well, how did those two get there? It went via a reporting engine that could have some calculation. So version control, who's approved reports, the rounding results is a big thing. You see a result in the lab, a result in the report, and say, well, yeah, that was 4 decimal places, this is 3 decimal places. What are the rules to get from 4 to 3 on the final report? And you don't want someone playing with those rules outside of good control. Conversion between units. Classic, most time it's sort of a decade, 100,000, but you may have a ounces per ton to gram per ton. There's a factor involved there. Could someone change the factor and no one noticed it? And if no one knows the factors change, you can get results coming out at conversion time, at report time, and it's not until later you realise, hang on, someone's been playing with the factor. Amending reports, and again, the old school where you have to reissue a report. It's very important to know for the standard that if a report is amended, it has to be very clearly identified as an amended report, which report number to replace. And we talked about the historic, the electronic reporting. And that tends to be the way. And that's why the things like the CHD, the historical database, a central reporting proof, we're the one version of the truth. It's not on a particular CSV, it's not a particular Excel spreadsheet, it's in one place. And so that has all parts of the standard to make sure that reporting is as it should be. Audit trails. We know the system needs to record who did it, when did they do it, what did they change, and sometimes why. Now, most LIMS will say, look, there's an audit trail in the system. The why a result is changed or why a factor is changed is often lost. You'll go in there and you'll make the change and the system won't say, oh, Why did you put that? Please write the whole explanation of why you've changed that. But that is part of the traceability. At least you've got to know who did it and when they did it and what they changed. What you may not know is why they done that change. And most of the audit trails are related to jobs and samples and results. But there is an aspect of, well, who changed the factors, who changed the formulas as well. Corrective actions, preventative actions, it's sort of a catchphrase. It goes into that client complaint. How do you track through a complaint being raised? Who's going to identify it? Who's going to resolve it? Is the customer happy at the end of it? It may be an internal complaint, internal problem that's been raised. How do you process that? The preventative actions and corrective actions is all part of that standard, and you need a system to allow you to do that. I've talked about complaint handling. Document management. This is a big one. Ian talked about the numbers and the dimensions of documents that need to be managed in a laboratory. Now, some of those documentations are not LIMS centric necessarily. So a LIMS that controls all the documents is probably too restrictive. Having a LIMS that talks to documents and having references and cross-references where it's applicable, but there is a need in the standard to have good documentation control. Out of control documents, who's approved that, who's verified that, where is that certificate? At the end of the day, if it is a certificate you generate, certificate analysis, where is that and is it traceable? Is it just in a folder somewhere that someone could delete? That's the only copy? That's not very good. So document management is very important in the standard. Okay, that's me fast track. But let's just pause for a second. If you're on a journey for ISO accreditation, please be aware it is a journey. It takes a lot of resources to get an understanding. Datamine and CCLAS can help, but there's a whole industry out there to support and encourage and to take a laboratory through the process to get ISO accreditation, if that's what you need. And it may be something that you want, even though you don't need it, because it does support those underlying confidences that you as a laboratory get the right result on quality, on time, and hopefully with the least amount of cost.